So Dr. Chubb is a postdoctoral fellow from Lancaster University. Dr. Chubb is currently undertaking a 3-year investigation of the role of domestic public opinion in international crisis diplomacy in the Asia Pacific. Dr. Chubb's areas of research include maritime and territorial disputes, strategic communication, political propaganda, and Chinese Communist Party history. His doctoral dissertation examined the complex and evolving linkages between Chinese popular nationalism and government policy in the South China Sea. In 2012, he initiated a survey project to measure mainland Chinese citizens' views of maritime disputes, and a blog providing translations and analysis of Chinese discourse on contentious foreign policy issues. Without further ado, please give a round of applause for Dr. Chubb.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for inviting me along. I really support these types of exercise. I think stimulation is really important for a range of different purposes, but perhaps among the most important, it's about standing in the shoes of others and building that strategic empathy. Very important in your future careers, no matter what you end up going into. So I'm really happy to offer some background based on my own research for your exercise today. The talk that I'll give, maybe 15 minutes or so before I answer any questions you might have, I'll go through the basic geography, so the different layers of the dispute and the different parties involved, the historical trajectory in particular of PRC policy, which is the biggest factor at the moment driving the dynamics there. And that wasn't always the case in previous decades. So it's important to bear in mind the background for where China is coming from, where its current position in the South China Sea. Then I'll look at 3 case studies of past recent crises in the South China Sea, which I hope will give you some pause for thought, in particular about the ways in which you might use publicity and attempt to manage public opinion in your own role plays. And then I'll just conclude with a few little quick reflections on the convergent and potential convergent and obvious divergent interests between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea. Just check that everything's still okay on the technical side. Fantastic. Okay, so looking at geography is of paramount importance to understand in the South China Sea. There's tremendous variation in the claimants and the nature of the disputes. I think the simplest way to understand that complexity is to think about the 3 different layers of disputes in the South China Sea. The first layer being about the sovereignty over islands. That's probably the simplest to understand. So the disputed island groups are the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands, which are both claimed in their entirety by the PRC and Vietnam. So bear that in mind as you're managing your crisis today, that the area that you're dealing with might in fact be subject to claims from other states beyond those that are directly involved in the crisis. You've also got the Philippines claiming most of the Spratly Islands and Malaysia claiming some of the Spratly Islands. It's indicated in the blue line here as Malaysia's claim in the slide on the screen, and the green line is the Philippines' claim to the Calayan Island group, which covers most of the Spratlys. Then the second layer of dispute is about maritime resource rights. And this layer of dispute is concerning things like fisheries and energy resources, which I think is central to your the scenario that you may be encountering today. There is not just those 4 claimants that I've mentioned already, but also Indonesia and Brunei involved in that layer of disputes down towards the far southern end of the South China Sea, where Indonesia's exclusive economic zone and Brunei's exclusive economic zone overlap with the 9-dash line area that delineates the approximate scope of China's claims there. And then finally, there's the layer of dispute between China and the countries that hold the majority interpretation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas provisions around freedom of navigation, particularly for military vessels, and also some differing interpretations on maritime scientific research, which is another thing that might be relevant for you to look into or be aware of today. So a tremendous amount of complexity, but you can basically look at it as three layers of disputes: island sovereignty, maritime resource rights, and freedom of navigation. So make sure you're clear about what's at stake in the particular handling of a crisis. Another point to make is that the PRC's claims to these islands actually date back, at least formally, all the way back to 1947, so before the PRC was founded in 1949. That's the first layer of dispute, the claims to the islands. However, the fisheries and energy, maritime resource rights disputes, as well as the freedom of navigation disputes, are much more recent. They only took shape in the UNCLOS era from the 1970s onwards. UNCLOS was finally sort of signed in 1982, but it had been negotiated for 10 years to that point. So it's from 1973 onwards that these disputes start to come to the fore, that second layer of disputes. Another thing to bear in mind is the particular part of the South China Sea that you will be dealing with, because the resources in the South China Sea, including the energy and the fisheries, as well as some undersea seabed resources, manganese and other minerals that are quite useful in certain industries, are not evenly distributed around the South China Sea. So there are, and you can look this up, the energy deposits are in certain parts of the South China Sea and they're not in others. So it's important to know which part of the South China Sea you're looking at. And then also bear in mind the natural environment varies quite considerably in the South China Sea from the archipelago, the sprawling sort of Spratly Islands, where you've got a number of genuine islands, but many, many more, in fact, hundreds of submerged reefs, which create extreme navigational hazards for any vessels that are operating in the area without the requisite experience. So becoming shipwrecked in the Spratly Islands is a genuine risk. And for that reason, it's far to the west. I don't know if you can see the cursor that I'm waving around on the screen, but it's far to the west of the Spratly Islands that those famously valuable shipping lines, the sort of, you hear figures like 3.3 trillion of the world's trade passes through the South China Sea. Well, that happens far, far to the west, well clear of the Spratly Islands, where the waters are deeper and there aren't so many of these coral reefs. So bear in mind the kind of navigational hazards that you may have to deal with if you want to operate in those areas. So the bottom line is that you really need to make sure that you're aware of what the claims are in the area and the geography of the particular part that you're dealing with. Can I just check that I'm still coming through okay? Excellent, thank you. Right, so next slide, if that's going to work. There we go. Okay, so another important piece of context is that the PRC has active disputes in many other places around its periphery. This may have formed part of your courses separately, but that's very important to bear in mind that in many cases, the Southeast Asian countries, Southeast Asian claimants in the South China Sea may have the South China Sea as their sort of primary or even only major dispute that they're involved with. The PRC has an arc of disputes around its border, both on the land side, particularly with India, and maritime disputes, of course, in the East China Sea, as well as the South China Sea, as well as the broadest scope of maritime disputes in the South China Sea, and even Taiwan, from a certain perspective, could also be seen as another of these unresolved maritime territorial disputes. Now, just to give you a sort of big picture overview of where the PRC is coming from in terms of its behavior in the South China Sea. This chart here is taken from my article last year in the journal International Security. And what it shows is the number of assertive moves by the PRC of different types in each year since 1970 through to 2015. The different types of assertive moves that they can make are declarative, those verbal only assertions. Demonstrative, that's where you go in unilaterally into the disputed geography, but you don't attempt to confront your adversary. Coercive, that's the red ones, the red blocks, which obviously you'd probably all be familiar with the concept of coercion, where you try to change the other's behavior through the threat or imposition of some form of punishment. And then the highest category, the direct seizure of the disputed territory by force. And so what this chart really shows, first of all, is that the PRC has been making assertive moves in just about every year since 1970 through to 2015. That's when my data collection ended. And so this means that assertive moves by the PRC are not in any way contrary to the historical norm. Within that overall trend, however, you can also discern at least 4 major surges in the PRC's assertiveness. One of them is down towards the left-hand end from 1973 to 75. The next one was from 1988 to 1987 through to 1989. Then there was another one in the 1990s where the bars get higher. It's the number of assertive moves that the PRC made from 92 to 95. And then the major change that we see in recent years really starts from 2007 onwards, where you see this block of high bars on the right-hand end of the chart from 2007. And that's the point at which the PRC starts its protracted buildup of its maritime constabulary presence, that is the Coast Guard boats that we hear a lot about these days, as well as the introduction of regular coercive actions for the first time from the PRC in 2007 onwards. That's this block of red bars down the right-hand end of the chart. So the bottom line here is that the PRC has really gone from being a sort of struggling, distant claimant that was, if you remember the previous chart, the Southeast Asian countries, their claims are all based on their coastal proximity to the area, whereas the PRC is very, very far away. So that's always presented very serious logistical challenges. Even down the left-hand end of the chart in the 1970s, 1980s, PRC is doing what it can to try to advance its claims there. It's just very, very distant. So it's a big struggle for the PRC. However, from 2007 onwards, these new maritime law enforcement capabilities that the PRC had started to develop from the 1990s onwards really start to come to fruition. The PRC is able to start really building up its regular patrolling presence in the disputed area and to start imposing coercive measures on its opponents in the area. However, it's important to bear in mind for your practical purposes that the PRC still faces major disadvantages in terms of the geography of the South China Sea. Major disadvantages because of the long distance and the remoteness from China's coast of operating in that area compared with its Southeast Asian opponents. The other thing to bear in mind is when the PRC obviously has surged in terms of its level of activity and its coerciveness in the area since 2007, but once you put the US in the picture as well, in a sort of high stakes scenario with the potential for the US military to get involved, then you could argue that rather than a situation of overwhelming PRC dominance in the area, you're looking at more of a situation of a balance of power. So it's important to keep in mind whether your scenario involves a plausible involvement of the United States in one capacity or another. That changes the overall strategic situation quite considerably. If it's China and the Southeast Asian countries on their own, then obviously a balance of power is not how we would describe that. It's highly imbalanced. Just a quick review of some of the trends since 2016, since that was the end of my formal sort of data collection at 2015. We've seen a continuation of that pattern from 2007 onwards. So that continuing administrative buildup in the form of island building and the like, as well as regular coercion of the Southeast Asian rivals in the South China Sea. There was a temporary moderation, very interestingly, of the PRC's assertive activities after the 2016 UNCLOS arbitration ruling, which was mentioned in your information pack, which also coincided with the arrival to the Philippines presidency of President Duterte. So it's hard to separate out what was the Duterte effect and what was the effect of the UNCLOS ruling, whether the PRC had to go away and study the UNCLOS ruling and sort of make a decision as to which behaviors which are contrary to the ruling it was going to continue and which it was going to sort of scale back from. However, we got the answer by sort of within 1 year after the ruling, because the PRC began operating as it had before around the edges of the 9-dash line, where it had no plausible claim under the UNCLOS in the wake of the ruling. So there was a temporary moderation in the PRC's conduct, which is worth thinking about. What were the conditions that brought that about? But within a year, the PRC's behavior had returned to its previous pattern. And then a final point about what's happened since 2016 is that the massive artificial islands that the PRC has built on coral reefs in the Spratly Islands has had some really major advantages in terms of the PRC's logistical challenges that I mentioned before of operating so far from the Chinese coastline. It's enabled the PRC to sustain its ships at sea for much more easily. And so we see these kinds of presence operations in 2019, 2020 against Vietnamese oil and gas survey activity, as well as Malaysian oil and gas survey activity at the far southern end of the South China Sea. It's arguable whether that would have even been possible before the island building campaign, because the ships that were implementing that sort of shadowing and harassment of the Southeast Asian operations were going back to the artificial islands for resupplies. So there's an argument that could be made that that really enabled the PRC to carry out those types of operations. So a few quick case studies of cases that might be somewhat comparable or have at least some kind of comparative value for you as you try to deal with the crisis that you will be dealing with this afternoon. The Impeccable incident you may well have heard of was a US-China incident, which are actually surprisingly rare in the South China Sea, given the level of attention that the South China Sea gets in the US. This is one of the rare incidents where the US was directly involved. And this was an incident in which PRC's maritime militia continuously harassed a US Navy surveillance ship off the coast of Hainan province, between Hainan and the disputed island group of the Paracel Islands. So this is in an area where it's basically subject to a PRC and Vietnam bilateral dispute, quite different from the Spratly Islands, where it's much more complex. And after several days of this harassment, the US vessel was eventually forced into an emergency stop by the unsafe maneuverings of these PRC fishing vessels or trawlers. Eventually they had to call in reinforcements from US naval ships. What was interesting about this case was that it was completely silent in the Chinese media. China didn't go public with the case at all. And it was only known to the Chinese public when the US went public, released a public protest and video footage of the evidence. So I think the shot on the screen is at top right is a screen grab from the digital video that the US side released. So it's worth thinking about what might be the advantages. Why would the US have done this? And what's the timing of the US's release of this information about this serious incident in the South China Sea? Very interestingly, the US released the video immediately after the incident was resolved. So that indicates that the US was perhaps looking to resolve the incident first before going public. You will have decisions perhaps to make in your own crisis simulation about when to go public and whether it be useful. There are other crisis examples, which I'll talk about just now, in which it might be useful for one side or another to go public during the crisis. Another case, I won't dwell too long on this. This was a lesser known series of cases actually between China and Indonesia, where Indonesian Coast Guard authorities tried to arrest Chinese fishing boats, or the crews of Chinese fishing boats, and they ended up in detention in Indonesia. And in fact, I think some ended up in detention in Malaysia as well. This is at the far southern end of the South China Sea again, where the PRC's 9-dash line intersects with Indonesia and Malaysia's UNCLOS-derived claims. And what happened in this case was very interesting because, again, the PRC had no particular intention of publicizing these incidents. Didn't exactly make the Chinese government look good because it showed that the Chinese government wasn't there to protect these Chinese fishermen who were fishing in what the Chinese government would say are, undisputably Chinese waters. These are fishermen being bullied by small Southeast Asian countries. So it wasn't in the interests of the central government to publicize these incidents. However, nonetheless, they made it into the Chinese media. And what was very interesting about this was that they didn't come from the central media. It came from lower level outlets at the provincial level. And there was an obvious driving force behind this in the form of the Fisheries Administration, which was the source for a lot of the juicy quotes and the details about what had happened. This is on the right-hand side. You can see one of these full-page splashes that appeared in the provincial media, talking about the anguish of the South China Sea, drawing attention to the fate of these fishermen who had been bullied by Southeast Asian countries. And this has been quite consequential because it put pressure on the Chinese government to actually start trying to enforce its claims at the far southern end of the South China Sea, where they, frankly, are most unreasonable, and where they bring China into conflict with, 2 more Southeast Asian countries. It wasn't necessarily something that was particularly strategically beneficial to the central government. Nonetheless, China's policies did change after this publicity campaign, and the PRC started getting involved in coercive incidents, trying to deter the Indonesian Coast Guard from arresting Chinese trawlers in the area. So this was the starting point really for the increase in Chinese public attention on the South China Sea from 2009 onwards. So it's only after 2009 that it really starts to become a hot button nationalist issue. And the Scarborough Shoal issue, which is also mentioned very briefly in your information pack, was another important case that shows some of the significance of publicity in the Chinese context. This is a case in which, you see the left-hand photo, the Chinese fishing militia in Scarborough Shoal were put under arrest by Philippine Marines who were on the ship pictured in the middle, the BRP Gregorio del Pilar, Philippines' most advanced naval warship at the time. And the incident was basically kept on a sort of low burn for the first month. It was a standoff in which Chinese marine surveillance ships were preventing the arrest, and that they were preventing the Philippine Marines from taking these fishing militia away for a trial in the Philippines. But it was a standoff situation. Nobody was going anywhere. The Philippines ship wasn't going anywhere. The Chinese ships weren't going anywhere. And the two sides, importantly, weren't talking to each other diplomatically. The Philippines had closed off diplomatic engagement and were saying, we're not willing to negotiate on this. 1 month into the standoff, after a month of this stalemate, the PRC Foreign Ministry, in conjunction with the propaganda organs, started really drawing attention to the issue within China, and a wave of nationalist warmongering emerged on the Chinese internet. Lots of talk about the potential for a war. And not coincidentally, this was right at the time when the Philippines decided to reverse course and to start talking to China again. And ultimately the Philippines did back down and did not escalate the crisis. And so it's an example of where China seems to have tried to draw domestic public attention towards the issue at a certain point in the crisis in order to compel the Philippines to come back to the negotiating table, or to refrain from any kind of escalatory behavior. So this would seem on the surface like PRC was able to make a good use, instrumental use of domestic public opinion to generate pressure on the Philippine side. However, this also came against a backdrop that I mentioned in the previous case study, backdrop of rising nationalist sentiment over the issue. There had been sustained public criticism on the Chinese internet of China's policies in the South China Sea as being, subjecting the Chinese nation to humiliation by small countries. That was a very strong narrative that also intersected with a very sensitive time on China's political calendar, the lead up to the 2012 18th Party Congress, which was very tumultuous in China's domestic politics. So it was a time in which Chinese politicians probably felt like it was extra high stakes, and there was all the more incentive, not to go against public opinion. So this is a very interesting case because it shows how Chinese nationalist public opinion can be a tool of the government when the government decides to sort of channel it strategically towards an issue. But also it's a factor that the Chinese government can't ignore. And sometimes channeling that nationalist anger strategically is a way of trying to neutralize it and ease the pressure on the Chinese government. That's kind of a safety valve type of function. So you can bear that in mind when you're making your decisions about whether or not to use public statements and the types of reactions that they might generate, both in the PRC, but also remember in the Philippines, there's very strong nationalist sentiments over these issues too. So just as a final sort of thing to leave you with, some considerations about what exactly are the divergences and potential convergences of the Philippines and China's interests. I've just focused on the Philippines and China here, but I'll be happy to take questions about other countries as well. So the most obvious divergence is sovereignty over those islands. But again, bear in mind, it's just over the islands that it's a real sovereignty claim where it's exclusive, indivisible. So there's no real way that you can chop up an island and share ownership of an island, at least under current international legal frameworks. So that's a divergent interest. Strategic control, the PRC has made clear that trying to control its own sea lanes is something that it has, it's always felt greatly insecure from the idea that the US could potentially interdict its shipping in the event of a crisis, a major crisis, or even a war in East Asia. So the PRC's interest clearly lies in unfolding strategic control over the entire Nine Dash Line area, whereas the United States and the Philippines, being aligned to the United States, has much more of an interest in a balance of power in the region, which China does not dominate. Ownership of the energy resources or the revenues, perhaps, could be seen as something that's indivisible, although in practice, there are such things as joint development agreements, which can actually be conceived of as convergent interests, and I'll talk about that just presently. But nonetheless, the resource revenues that flow into the government's coffers do have to be divided up at some level, and so there is a divergence of interests there too. And then finally, both sides, as I mentioned, face domestic nationalist audiences that they want to appear to win in a crisis in front of. Now, it may well be that they find a convergent interest in a face-saving type of climb down that allows both sides to claim victory. But nonetheless, at the same time, they don't want their domestic audiences to hear the other side's narrative of its own victory. So there is a divergence of interest there in terms of the management of public opinion. Convergent interests, well, those of you familiar with the great Thomas Schelling's work would be familiar with the idea that, simply avoiding war is a common interest. It's a convergent interest, and it's a matter that states in general cooperate on every day. Every day that there's not a nuclear war between two adversarial nuclear powers, they're engaging in a form of cooperation over their shared interest in no nuclear war. And so the Philippines and China clearly share an interest in overall stability in the South China Sea, the absence of a disastrous war that would hinder both of their economic development and potentially implicate the lives of many of their people. Sustainability of fisheries as well. The South China Sea fisheries are reportedly, according to scientists, marine biologists, are reportedly on the brink of collapse. And so if fisheries in the South China Sea continue to be overexploited, there's a very high likelihood that it'll be a tragedy of the commons situation. And so sustainable management of the fisheries resources across the whole South China Sea area is clearly in the interests of all of the disputant parties. Potentially, I mentioned joint development. On some occasions, it may be that access to the energy resources, rather than collecting the revenues, is the most important the most important concern for the state. And this is something that state interests can converge on, because if they're feuding over the ownership of the resources, it denies them both access to those resources. And so there may be a convergent interest in cooperating. That's how you get these joint development agreements, which then move to a situation of negotiation over what happens with the profits, and also with how it's going to be framed in terms of sovereignty, or and which institutions and organizations are going to be involved in the exploitation of those resources. And then finally, both sides also, related to the need to maintain stability, both sides share an interest in maximizing their freedom of maneuver in front of their domestic audiences. So there may well be, often be, interests in cooperating to keep an incident out of the public eye, unless there's some strong countervailing reason to want to bring domestic forces into it. It may well be that the two sides share a convergent interest in keeping an issue out of the public eye until such time as it's been neutralized, so as to maximize their freedom of diplomatic maneuver. So with that, I will hand back to your hosts, who I can't see on the screen, but I assume they're out there. And I think they're going to moderate whatever questions you might have. I can stick around for about another 10 minutes.
To take 2 questions. Or any participants today who'd like to ask a question for Dr. Chubb?
I'm also happy to answer any follow-ups on email.
You could just, I think if you just ask, or yeah, you can go through it.
Hello, sir. Matt Evers, Marine Corps Logistics Officer. And you talked a lot about the economic domain, maritime domain. I was wondering if you could elaborate if there's any developments, or to frame the situation on the information domain. If there's anything about PRC China development in the Philippines or South China Sea that might frame the context for the players today.
Sorry, I muted myself. Yes, well, just to clarify that question, do you mean in terms of the electromagnetic spectrum and the communications in the area, or are you talking about the management of, information flowing to domestic and international audiences?
To the first point, you did touch a little bit on the narratives, and those were good examples that you provided. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the first point, the infrastructure aspect, electromagnetic spectrum.
That's not something that I have studied in detail myself. I do know that all sides have attempted to, install mobile communications. That, in fact, they've used mobile communications infrastructure to assert sovereignty. You get messages if you sail through the Spratly Islands. You get messages from different countries' national mobile phone providers saying, welcome to Vietnam, welcome to China, welcome to the Philippines. So that's one way that the sovereignty dispute has been playing out. I don't know enough about the specific technologies that would be potentially used in a crisis, but to sort of interfere with other countries, military, C4ISR. I think it would be better for someone expert in that particular field to answer that particular question. But I think you could rest assured that in a serious crisis situation, multiple sides are going to be doing what they can to try to interfere with the communications with the adversaries' communications on the water. The extent to which that is actually possible will depend on each side's, not only their existing technology, but what they can muster in terms of support from countries, allies like the United States. And I'll just add also that in some of those Indonesian fisheries incidents that I mentioned from 2009, there were some other ones that took place in 2012 and 2013, during which the Indonesian maritime law enforcement vessel reported being unable to contact its base headquarters in the Natuna Islands, which implied, and there hasn't been a whole lot of talk about that since, but this strongly implied that the PRC maritime law enforcement vessels may possess some kind of jamming technology on board that was actually effective against the Indonesian Coast Guard. That's the only direct example, directly pertinent sort of comparison example that I can think of offhand.
Do we have another question?
No more questions. I'll be very happy to go and get some lunch.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Chubb. We really appreciate it.
Not a problem. And feel free to reach out on email. Good luck with the simulation today.
Thank you.